26. The Life Buoy. Steering now southeastward by Ahab's leveled steel, and her progress solely determined by Ahab's level log and line, the Pequod held on her path toward the equator, making so long a passage through such unfrequented waters, descrying no ships, and ere long sideways impelled by unvarying trade winds, over ways monotonously mild. All these seem strange, calm things, preluding to some riotous and desperate scene. At last, when the ship drew near the outskirts, as it were, of the equatorial fishing ground, and in the deep darkness that goes before the dawn, was sailing by a cluster of rocky isles, the watch, then headed by Flask, was started by a cry so plaintively wild and unearthly, like half-articulated wailings of the ghosts of all Herod's murdered innocents, that one and all they started from their reveries, and for the space of some moments stood, or sat, or leaned, all transfixedly listening, like the carved Roman slave, while that wild cry remained within hearing. The Christian or civilized part of the crew said it was mermaids and shuddered, but the pagan harpooners remained unappalled. Yet the grey Manxman, the oldest mariner of all, declared that the wild, thrilling sounds that we heard were the voices of newly drowned men in the sea. Below in his hammock, Ahab did not hear of this till grey dawn, when he came to deck. It was then recounted to him by Flask, not unaccompanied with hinted dark meanings. He hollowly laughed, and thus explained in the wonder. Those rocky islands the ship had passed were a sort of resort for a great number of seals, and some young seals that had lost their dams, or some dams that had lost their cubs, must have risen nigh the ship and kept company with her, crying and sobbing with their human sort of wail. But this only the more affected some of them, because most mariners cherish a very superstitious feeling about seals, arising not only from their peculiar tones when in distress, but also from the human look of their round heads and semi-intelligent faces, seen peeringly uprising from the water alongside. In the sea, under certain circumstances, seals have more than once been mistaken for men. But the boatings of the crew were destined to receive a most plausible confirmation in the fate of one of their number that morning. At sunrise, this man went from his hammock to his masthead at the fore, and whether it was that he was not yet half waked from his sleep, for sailors sometimes go aloft in a transition state, whether it was thus with the man, there is no telling, but be that as it may, he had not been long at his perch when a cry was heard, a cry and a rushing. Looking up, they saw a falling phantom in the air, and, looking down, a little tossed heap of white bubbles in the blue of the sea. The life buoy, a long, slender cask, was dropped from the stern, where it always hung obedient to a cunning spring, but no hand rose to seize it, and the sun having long beat upon the cask, it had shrunken, so that it slowly filled, and that parched wood was also filled at its every pore, and the studded, iron-bound cask followed the sailor to the bottom, as if to yield to him his pillow, though in sooth but a hard one. And thus the first man of the Pequod that mounted the mast, to look out for the white whale, on the white whale's own peculiar ground, that man was swallowed up by the deep. Few indeed perhaps thought of that at the time. Indeed, in some sort they were not very grieved at this event, at least as a portent, for they regarded it not as a foreshadowing of evil in the future, but as the fulfillment of evil already presaged. They declared that now they knew the reason of those wild shrieks they had heard the night before, but again the old Manxman said nay. The lost life buoy was now to be replaced. Starbuck was directed to see to it, but as no cask of sufficient lightness could be found, and as in the feverish eagerness of what seemed to be the approaching crisis of the voyage, all hands were impatient of any toil but what was directly connected with its final end, whether that might prove to be. Therefore, they were going to leave the ship's stern unprovided with a buoy, when, by certain strange signs and innuendos, Queequeg hinted at a hint concerning his coffin. "A life buoy of a coffin," cried Starbuck, starting. "Rather queer that, I should say," said Stubb. "It will make a good enough one," said Flask. "The carpenter here can arrange that easily." "Bring it up. There's nothing else for it," said Starbuck after a melancholy pause. "Rig it, carpenter. Do not look at me so. The coffin, I mean. Dost thou hear me? Rig it." And shall I nail down the lid, sir, moving his hands as with a hammer? Aye. And shall I caulk the seam, sir, moving his hands as with a caulking iron? Aye. And shall I then pay over the same with pitch, sir, moving his hand as with a pitch pot? Away, what possesses thee to this? Make a life buoy of the coffin and no more. Mr. Stubb, Mr. Flask, come forward with me. He goes off in a huff. The whole he can endure, at the parts he balks. Now I don't like this. I make a leg for Captain Ahab, and he wears it like a gentleman. I make a bandbox for Queequeg, and he won't put his head into it. Are all my pains to go for nothing with that coffin? And now I'm ordered to make a life buoy of it. It's like turning an old coat, going to bring the fresh on the other side now. I don't like this cobbling sort of business. I don't like it at all. It's undignified. It's not my place. Let tinkers' brats do their tinkering. We are their betters. I like to take in hand none but the clean, virgin, fair, and square mathematical job, something that regularly begins with the beginning, and this is the middle when midway, and comes to an end at the conclusion. Not a cobbler's job, that's an end in the middle, and a beginning at the end. It's the old woman's tricks to be giving cobbling jobs. Lord, what an affection old women have for tinkers. I know an old woman of 65 who ran away with a bald-headed young tinker once, and that's the reason I never would work for a lovely old woman ashore when I kept my job shop at the vineyard. They might have taken it into their lonely old heads to run off with me. But hi-ho, there are no caps at sea but snow caps. Let me see, nail down the lid, caulk the seams, pay over the same with pitch, batten them down tight, and hang it with a snap spring over the ship's stern. Were there ever such a thing done before with a coffin? Some superstitious old carpenters now would be tied up in the rigging ere they would do the job. By maid of narty arstook hemlock, I don't budge. Cruppered with a coffin, sailing about with a graveyard tray, but never mind. We workers in woods make bridal bedsteads and card tables as well as coffins and hearses. We work by the month or by the job or by the profit, not for us to ask why and wherefore of our work unless it is to be too confounded cobbling. And then we stash it if we can. Hem, I'll do the job now, tenderly. I'll have me, let's see, how many in the ship's company all told, but I've forgotten. Anyway, I'll have me 30 separate Turk's-headed lifelines, each 3 foot long, hanging all around the coffin. Then if the hull go down, there'll be 30 lively fellows all fighting for one coffin. A sight not very often seen beneath the sun. Come, hammer, caulking iron, pitch pot, marlin spike, let's to it. This is the end of chapter 126. So they had a life buoy on the boat. So just in case somebody falls off the mast, like the guy did, or falls off the side of the ship, like other people have, they toss them the life buoy. It's set on the stern or the back of the ship. So the ship is going forward. Someone falls off. They can shoot the life buoy off the stern. Person can swim a little bit over to it, and then the ship can come around for them, or they can lower a boat and go back for them. So, the life buoy is there to make it easier for the person to stay up. Now, the original life buoy was a barrel. It was a cask. And so it had the iron hoops. But as I said before in the chapter with where they were hosing down the barrels down in the bottom of the ship hull, the wood shrinks, but wet wood expands. So what happened was the wood of the barrel shrank a little bit. And because it shrank a little bit, the moment it hit the water, it started filling. And once it filled, the weight of the iron, the weight of the wood, the weight of the water, all of that stuff started sinking. And the person who was trying to hold on to it sank with it. So here was somebody carried to the bottom of the sea, carried to their grave by something that was supposed to save them. So they're like, okay, we got to make a new cask, but they don't have anything right for it. And the carpenter's like, I can just make one. Everyone's like, no, we don't want to make. And then someone said, hey, Queequeg's coffin. Or Queequeg actually suggested, hey, my coffin. Which goes into this really weird sort of thing of something that was meant to carry a dead body will now be used to save live ones, which is a good use of things. And the carpenter is complaining because this is a cobbler's job. Now, a cobbler is someone who repairs shoes. They're not someone who makes shoes. They're someone who repairs them. The process of making a shoe is the job of a cordwainer. And that's someone who is specialized in cutting the leather, dyeing, preparing, and all of these other things to make the shoe. The cobbler is someone who repairs. So if you have the sole of the shoe worn out, then the cobbler can take a new sole and put it on, or he can patch the hole in the bottom of the shoe, or he can, fix the toe of the shoe. And, the cobbler's job is to fix little pieces of things. It's not his job to make something new. Just like a tinker, you have a blacksmith, a goldsmith, a silversmith. And these are people who make new things out of gold or silver, iron. Then you have, or a tinsmith who makes things out of tin. Then you have a tinker. And a tinker's job is to repair the things made out of gold or silver, or tin or iron. And it's a different set of tools and it's a different set of skills. So for instance, a tinker will weld on a patch to a pot, or he will fix a crack in a cast iron pot, or he will, do various little repair jobs, put on a new handle. So that's the realm of the tinker. The tinker doesn't have the ability to cast an iron pot. He doesn't have the tools and equipment to make a whole tin pot. He might be able to do a little weld on a piece of jewelry, but don't expect him to make a whole thing. So, if you have a broken necklace, a tinker would be the type of person who would go and solder together the broken bit of the necklace. So here you have the carpenter. He's like, I am a carpenter. I make new things. And, the crew is like, cobble. He's like,